Now, with some preliminary backstory out of the way, here's a list of the Visigothic kings from the late 6th century up until the Muslim invasions in 711. Beyond the distinctly Gothic names, what immediately stands out is instability. In the 127 years from their conversion to Catholicism to the invasion of the Arabs, the Visigoths had 18 kings, one of whom only ruled for a few months, and most only for a few years. One can easily imagine that Spain was full of rival factions, that it was steeped in complex politics, and that every action a person of any importance took was essentially a chess move. Concerning the Jews in this political mosaic, historian Edward Thompson wrote that, quote, "It will hardly be thought that the storms of these years centered on the position and liberties of the Jews in Spain. It is safest to think that the conspiracies were the outcome of the rival ambitions of different Gothic noblemen," unquote. However, in response to this, Bernard Bachrach wrote, quote, "Yet it seems reasonable to hypothesize that the Jews, as a formidable faction on the Visigothic scene, were supporters of Swintilla and Kindeswint, and were opposed to Sisebut, Sisinand, Quintilla, and Tulga. The violent nature of the Visigothic royal succession strongly suggests that, for example, a noble like Kindeswint, who sought to overthrow the dynasty of Quintilla, would first try to obtain the support of the Jewish party that suffered under the policies of that dynasty. Therefore, while the issue of Jewish liberties was very probably not a casus belli for the various Gothic noblemen who sought to seize the throne, the position of the Jewish faction may well have been an important factor in determining the nature of the Jewish policy pursued by the king, whether he was a successful rebel or a legitimate monarch," unquote. This is essentially the foundation of my own view. Jews were one of many ethno-religious groups and political factions in Visigothic Spain vying for power and influence. When they aligned themselves with the kings who won the throne, they prospered. When they backed the contenders who lost, they suffered. Now, this is not to say that Christians and Jews didn't consider each other theological opposition, or that some Visigothic kings and clergy had no religiously based anti-Jewish motivations. But there is a modern tendency to view all past events involving Jews through a prism of unquestionable Jewish victimhood, without any attempt to examine whether or not the Jews, at times, brought animosity on themselves via their behavior. The first recorded instance of anti-Jewish policies in Spain actually predates the Visigoths. In the early 4th century, before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Council of Elvira was convened, and out of 81 of its canons, a handful addressed Jews specifically. Canon 16 specifically prohibited marriage between Christians and Jews, and proclaimed that parents who allowed their daughters to marry a Jew would be denied communion for 5 years. Canon 78 dictated that Christians who committed adultery with Jews would be ostracized. Canon 49 oddly forbade the blessing of Christian crops by Jews, the rationale being that it rendered Christian blessings, quote, invalid and meaningless, unquote. And Canon 50 forbade the sharing of meals between Christians and Jews. Concerning pagans, however, the council was even harsher. Canon 17 dictated that parents who allowed their daughters to marry pagans would be denied communion even at death. In Canons 2 through 4, the council attempted to regulate the behavior of baptized pagan priests. In the interest of time, however, I'll only read Canon 4, which states that, quote, Flemens who have been catechumens for 3 years and who have abstained from sacrifices may be baptized, unquote. It should be stressed here that the Jews were not the most persecuted religious group. The pagans were, and more importantly, the Jews themselves had already established cultural and legal precedent virtually identical to these canons. See the laws of Bishu Yisrael, whereby Jews were forbidden to eat with Gentiles, lest they intermarry. In chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, God tells the Jews, while referring to Gentiles, that, quote, do not intermarry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. This is what you are to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. Unquote.
The thing that makes Judaism dangerous to everybody, to every race, to every nation, to every idea, is that we smash things that aren't true. We don't believe in the boundaries of nation-state. We don't believe in the ideas of these individual gods that protect individual groups of people. These are all artificial constructions, and Judaism really teaches us how to see that. In a sense, our detractors have us right, in that we are a corrosive force. We're breaking down the false gods of all nations and all people because they're not real. And that's very upsetting to people.
Regarding Jewish customs in 7th century Spain, Bernard Bachrach states that, quote, according to Jewish custom, a woman who had willingly and openly gone to live with a non-Jew would have been considered dead by her family and by the Jewish community. It was the legal duty of the community to stone her to death if she could be found. If she was not put to death, it is likely that such a woman and her offspring would have had no standing within the Jewish community, unquote. Interestingly, Christianity had been largely considered a Jewish sect up until the 2nd century, when Jews began pushing Christians out of their religious community. Jewish scholar Lawrence Schiffman informs us, quote, the Pharisees had emerged from the revolt against Rome as the main influence within the Jewish community. After the destruction of the temple, the Tanaim immediately recognized the need to standardize and unify Judaism. One of the first steps was to standardize the 18 benedictions, which, along with the Shema, constituted the core of the daily prayers. At the same time, they expanded an old prayer to include an imprecation against the Menim, Jews with incorrect beliefs. In this period, this could only have meant the early Jewish Christians, who observed the laws of Judaism, but accepted the messiahship of Jesus. Although the rabbis continued to regard the early Christians as Jews, they reformulated this prayer in order to expel them from the synagogue, as testified to by the Gospel of John and the Church Fathers. In addition, the Tanaim enacted laws designed to further separate the Jewish Christians from the community by prohibiting commerce and certain interrelationships with them. Hereafter, it is possible to trace the process of separation from the end of the 1st century CE until the period of the Bar Kokhba revolt, when the Tanaim outlawed the writings of the early Christians, declaring that scrolls or texts with divine names copied by Christians had no sanctity. This was clearly a polemic against the Gospels, which must have been circulating in some form by now. In the time of Paul, about 60 CE, the decision to open Christianity to Gentiles had taken place, and the Tanaim gradually found themselves facing a church whose members were not Jews from the point of view of halakha. To the rabbis, they were not Jews with incorrect views about the Messiah, but Gentiles who claimed to be the true Israel. For this reason, the Tanaim began to see the Christians as the other, not as Jews who had gone astray. This process was complete by the Bar Kokhba period. Jewish Christianity had been submerged, while Gentile Christianity had gained the ascendancy. Since it was now virtually the only form of Christianity the rabbis encountered, they termed the Christians Notzerim, regarding them as a completely separate and alien religious group, unquote. Returning to Visigothic Spain, a commonly held belief is that Recared's conversion to Catholicism was marked by a general departure from otherwise amicable relations with Jews. In 589, he made Catholicism the official religion at the Third Council of Toledo. In Canon 14, the council proclaimed that, quote, on the council's proposal, our most glorious Lord ordered that it should be entered in the canons that Jews should not be allowed to have Christian wives or concubines, nor to purchase a Christian slave for their own use. Yet if any sons were born in such a marriage, they must be taken to be baptized. It is necessary that they should not act in any public office that would provide them with the opportunity to inflict punishment on Christians. Indeed, if any Christians have been defiled by them in the Jewish rite, or have been even circumcised, they should return to liberty and the Christian religion, with no repayment of their price, unquote. Consider that the presence of laws is often taken as an indicator of overall social trends. Indeed, these anti-Jewish laws are the only evidence historians have that the Jews were oppressed by the Visigoths. But viewing laws as evidence of social trends cuts both ways. The laws barring Jews from positions of authority wherein they were able to punish Christians may have been enacted because Jews were in fact using positions of authority to punish Christians. Moreover, it is astonishing that laws prohibiting the Jewish ownership of Christian slaves have ever been considered an injustice by anyone, and yet they frequently are. Andrew Scharf wrote concerning such laws in Christian Byzantium that, quote, the Jews were not allowed to own Christian slaves. This disability was also punitive. Slavery, as we have seen, was important to the economy, and there was no disapproval of Christian slavery as such, unquote. In this day and age, many people might be hoodwinked by this rationale until one realizes it can be used to justify the Atlantic slave trade. It is well known that Africans had been enslaving fellow Africans, and slavery was an important part of the economy. Yet it seems absurd that these facts alone should have entitled Europeans to African slaves. Had the Africans prohibited the sale of their fellow Africans to outsiders, surely no one today would consider it to have been a punitive measure. Several things must also be stressed here concerning Recared's quote-unquote forced baptisms of quote-unquote Jewish children. According to Jewish law and custom, only children born to a Jewish mother would have been considered Jewish at birth. Thus, children born to a Christian woman and a Jewish man were not considered Jewish by the community, then or now, unless they underwent the rites of conversion. Regarding conversion and how converts were generally received, Bernard Bachrach comments in his bibliography on the matter while addressing the framers of Canon 14 at the Third Council of Toledo. Quote, "The idea of mixed marriages, so common today, i.e. a marriage of a Jew to a non-Jew, is inconceivable in early medieval Jewish law. Jews could marry converts to Judaism, though the latter were often discriminated against." Unquote. Interestingly, the Jewish Encyclopedia informs us that in the year 19 AD, the Roman Emperor Tiberius expelled the Jews in Rome after they had committed fraud against one of their own converts. Quote, "Fulvia, a Roman lady of high station, converted to Judaism through the teachings of a Jew who had sought refuge in Rome to escape punishment. This impostor, together with 3 others, persuaded her to contribute purple and gold for the temple at Jerusalem, which contributions they kept for themselves. The discovery of this fraud by the Emperor Tiberius, through his friend Saturninus, Fulvia's husband, caused the banishment of the Jews from Rome." Unquote. While this is a single anecdote, it's a powerful one. It must have taken some nerve for Jews who had sought safety in Rome to con and rob a noblewoman whom they had converted to their own religion. Surely that reflects something of a general attitude of resentment both to Romans and to converts. Converts aside, though, as Bernard Bachrach highlights, the illegitimate offspring of Jewish women and Christian men presented a, quote, slightly more ambiguous situation. He states that since the Jewish community in Spain ostracized their women who had relations with non-Jewish men, quote, "it seems reasonable to assume that problems arising from the baptism of the illegitimate offspring of the Jewish concubines of Christian men were not of central importance to Judeo-Christian relations during the reign of King Recared. Recared seems to have done no more in his legislation than accept the laws of his Arian predecessors, who are generally regarded as having been tolerant. The charge that he initiated a policy of persecution and forced conversion cannot be sustained." Unquote. Indeed, in Deuteronomy 23:2, the Jews are instructed that, quote, "those born of an illicit union shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord." Unquote. This is reaffirmed within the Talmud, for example in Yevamot 76b, although Yevamot makes an exception for women of certain non-Jewish tribes. The general term for a child born to an illicit union in Judaism was mamzer, and this is the term used in the original Hebrew of Deuteronomy 23:2. This is described by several sources as a child born of a Jewish father and a heathen mother, or vice versa. Actually, all things considered, Recared's legislation might be seen as fairly inclusive, since it seems likely that the Jewish community would have rejected all the children born of mixed marriages. Whatever the case, it is quite curious that the Jews had laws that directly corresponded to those of the Third Council, and yet no one has ever dared call those laws anti-Christian. While forced conversions did take place under King Sisebut, Requeswent, Erwig, and Egeka, concerning the notion that Recared was harsher on Jews than his predecessors, Bernard Bachrach makes a case that, if anything, he was actually more lenient. Quote, "Among the laws promulgated in 506 by Alaric II for his subjects was one decreeing the death penalty for Jews convicted of converting, or of attempting to convert, Christians to Judaism. Recared, in his laws, eliminated the death penalty for these offenses. When the Provincial Synod of Narbonne in 589 passed a host of acts severely injurious to Jews, including a prohibition against the performance of certain religious services, Recared refused to approve the acts. In 597, Pope Gregory I wrote Recared to call his attention to the fact that Jews at Narbonne, contrary to law, were dealing in Christian slaves, and that royal officials were doing nothing about it. Recared ignored the Pope's request that the trade be halted. Most important, Recared refused to enforce existing laws that in any way disadvantaged the Jews in his kingdom." Unquote. To understand the historical context of the Third Council of Toledo, we have to go back to the year 506, when King Alaric II enacted the Breviarium Alaricianum. This was a continuation of the Visigothic Code enacted under King Euric, which itself was built upon Roman precedent. As Thompson notes, quote, "Alaric discarded most of the Roman laws relating to the Jews, but he retained the ban on intermarriage between Romans and Jews, which Jewish law also prohibited, and which the Council of Elvira had frowned upon at the beginning of the 4th century." Unquote. It should also be highlighted here that the secular law in question, upon which Euric and Alaric built the Visigothic Code, had also forbade marriage between Goths and Romans, regardless of religious faith, and this prohibition remained intact under Alaric and all his successors up until the mid-7th century. Putting that aside, Thompson notes that under Alaric, quote, "Jews and Samaritans were forbidden to hold any public appointment, civil or military, or to be defensor of a city, or a prison guard, for they might use these positions to inflict harm on Christians, even on Christian priests. They were allowed to repair their synagogues, but not to build new ones. If they did so, the building was to be converted into a Catholic church, and the builders were to pay the ruinous fine of 50 pounds gold to the treasury." Unquote. Again, if laws are to be taken as evidence of social trends and behaviors, then we should conclude that at least some Jews had been using their positions of authority to abuse Christians in some fashion. Moreover, Jews at the time had a great deal of autonomy that Christians were required by law to respect. Thompson notes that, quote, "Civil suits between Jews, if both parties agreed, might be heard by their own clergy rather than in the public courts, and in such cases, the decisions of their clergy were as binding as if they had been imposed by a royal judge. Jews could not be dunned for debts to the treasury or on any other account on the Jewish Sabbath." Unquote. What we see here is that overall, Jewish autonomy was highly respected both under Alaric and Recared, and that there was even a decline in the number of anti-Jewish laws under Alaric, and a slight decline in the severity of the punishments for their infractions under Recared. As for the three kings who succeeded Recared, Bachrach tells us that, quote, "Liuwa, Witteric, and Gundamar, Recared's three immediate successors, continued his policy toward the Jews. They made no effort to enforce the existing anti-Jewish laws, and they promulgated no new anti-Jewish laws. At the local level, both lay and clerical officials ignored the existing anti-Jewish legislation. In addition, Jews continued to own Christian slaves and hold civil and military positions in which they exercised power over Christians." Unquote. So, basically, all the anti-Jewish laws from before and after Recared were ignored and existed in name only. The real turning point in the 7th century toward an unquestionably anti-Jewish policy in the Visigothic kingdom was when Sisebutt acquired the throne in 612. According to virtually all sources and historians, Sisebutt not only vigorously enforced the anti-Jewish laws on the books, but he went much further. Edward Thompson informs us, quote, "Sisebutt's first aim was to remove all Christian slaves from Jewish ownership as quickly as possible, and to free Christian freedmen from Jewish patronage. Indeed, Sisebutt even says, though he does not develop the point, that no hired workman may be employed by a Jew. A Jew, therefore, must sell his Christian slave and the slave's property, peculium, to a Christian purchaser at a fair price. But he must sell him in the locality, near his normal dwelling place, for the slave's convenience, and also perhaps so as to prevent Jews from handing on their slaves to their brethren in Africa and France. If the slave had no property, he must supply him with some. Alternatively, he might manumit the slave, who would then become a Roman citizen liable to tax. But the Jew could not become the freedman's patron. Fictitious sales were severely punishable. These provisions were to be carried out before July 1st, 612, and, if a Jew were found to be in possession of a Christian slave after that date, the treasury would confiscate 1/2 of his property, and the slave would be freed. The king next turned to proselytism and mixed marriages. In the matter of proselytism, Sisebutt reverted to the harsh position of Alaric II, which Recared had mitigated. A Jew who converted a Christian to Judaism was now to be put to death and his property taken by the treasury. If anyone who was converted to Judaism refused to return to the church, He was to be publicly whipped, suffer decalvation, and become the slave of a nominee of the crown. In the case of mixed marriages, which were illegal, if the Jewish partner refused to join the Catholic Church, he or she must go into exile for life. But if such persons turned Catholic and were baptized, they were allowed to keep all their property, including their slaves. Slaves born of the marriage of Christian and Jew were Christians, whether they liked it or not. This part of the law, too, was to be put into effect before July 1st of the current year. The king ended his law by calling down a fearful curse on any ruler who should fail to enforce it in the future, and his curse was remembered with lively fear by King Erwig some 70 years later. Sisebut observes that the law was enacted with all the Palatine officium, but makes no mention of the bishops." Unquote. A quick note on decalvation. Some assert that it involved scalping. Others are convinced that it was merely a matter of clipping a person's hair very short. In favor of the latter interpretation, various sources have indicated that a person could undergo the punishment more than once. The Franks held a similar practice of shaving people's hair, as did the Jews. However, historian Roger Collins is convinced that it involved scalping, whereas all the other historians either have not drawn a definitive conclusion or lean slightly toward it being similar to the Frankish custom. For a full analysis, see Jace Crouch's paper on the subject. Putting decalvation aside, though, note that under Sisebut, fictitious sales of slaves were highly punishable. The insinuation is that the Jews were falsifying legal documents so that they could circumvent the law and retain their Christian slaves. Regarding forced conversions, Solomon Katz tells us that in 613, Sisebut, quote, ordered that all the Jews must either quit his realms forever or become Christians, unquote. As evidence, Katz cites a few sources. The most detailed, but also the most far removed, is that of Solomon ibn Berga, a Jewish historian of the 16th century, who, according to Katz, claimed that, quote, the Jews, assembled with tears and groans in the court of the palace, obtained an audience and held a theological debate with the king, but to no avail, unquote. The work cited is called the Shebet Yehuda, or Scepter of Judah. While it's often regarded as a highly valuable text, it's also been widely criticized as an inaccurate historical source. Katz even notes in his own bibliography that Berga committed, quote, an anachronism and fixed the reign of Sisebut in the year 800, unquote. Unfortunately, the Shebet Yehuda is currently beyond my reach. But here's what scholar Rebecca Rist had to say about it. Quote, the Shebet Yehuda often deliberately veils original and daring views by embedding them in fictitious dialogues, interwoven between real historical accounts of past persecutions. This serves to produce a complex mixture of history and fiction, while its satiric nature makes it problematical to untangle real opinions from intentional ambiguities, unquote. Another source Katz cites is Isidore Seville, a prominent and contemporary 7th century bishop in the region, who wrote the following on the matter. Quote, at the beginning of his reign, Sisebut forced the Jews into the Christian faith, indeed acting with zeal, but not according to knowledge. For he compelled by force those who should have been called to the faith through reason. But as it is written, whether through chance or truth, Christ is to be proclaimed. Sisebut was nonetheless eloquent in speech, informed in his opinions, and imbued with no little knowledge of letters, unquote. Edward Thompson agrees with Katz that there were forced conversions, though he doesn't cite even Berga. He cites the Chronicle of 754, which says the following, quote, in the time of Heraclius, in the era 612, in his second year as emperor, when the Saracens were still under tribute to the Romans, Sisebut, a wise man of profound learning, became king of Spain and ruled for 8 years. He conquered the Roman cities throughout Spain. He compelled the Jews to enter the Christian faith, unquote. Thompson also cites an entry in the chronology listed in Isidore Seville's Etymologiae that states, quote, Heraclius governs for the 7th year. During the 4th and 5th year of the most religious ruler Sisebut, the Jews in Spain convert to Christianity, unquote. Thompson also highlights that at the subsequent 4th Council of Toledo in 633, some 12 years after Sisebut's death, the clergy, quote, explicitly and firmly condemned the policy of force, and referred specifically to those who had been violently converted by the most religious prince, Sisebut, unquote. Here's the pertinent Canon 57 translated by scholar Amnon Linder, quote, on the Jews, however, thus did the Holy Synod order that no one should henceforth be forced to believe. God hath mercy on whom he will, and whom he will he hardeneth. Such men should not be saved unwillingly, but willingly, in order that the procedure of justice should be complete. For just as man perished obedient to the serpent out of his own free will, so will any man be saved, when called by the divine grace, by believing and in converting his own mind. They should be persuaded to convert, therefore of their own free choice, rather than forced by violence. Those, however, who were formerly forced to come to Christianity, as was done in the days of the most religious Prince Sisebut, since it is clear that they have been associated in the divine sacraments, received the grace of baptism, were anointed with chrism, and partook of the body and blood of the Lord, it is proper that they should be forced to keep the faith, even though they had undertaken it under duress, lest the name of the Lord be blasphemed, and the faith they had undertaken be treated as vile and contemptible." Unquote. The line that Linder translates as "rather than forced by violence" could easily be translated as "rather than by impelling or instigating them." In fact, the English verb to impel is derived from the Latin word impello, which is the word used in the original text. The Latin word holds both literal and figurative connotations, and Linder's translation of it to refer to violence conjures up very specific images that may be unwarranted. While Thompson agrees with Linder's translation, he also tells us that, quote, "no details are known about these forcible conversions," unquote, and moreover that they were made, quote, "without the enactment of a law and without the authority of any church council," unquote. Indeed, there is no contemporary document, secular or ecclesiastic, of any order given by Sisebut that compelled the Jews to either convert or leave the realm, as Solomon Katz phrased it. The best primary sources are the aforementioned minutes and canons from the Fourth Council of Toledo, and they never make clear what these conversions entailed or how they were carried out. An additional source that Katz cites later on is Samuel Uske, a converso Jew living in Portugal during the 16th century. Again, I don't have access to the original text, but Katz claims that, quote, "Uske says that Sisebut first gave the Jews the choice between baptism and death, but later permitted them to leave the country if they preferred. Uske himself depends upon earlier sources which are no longer extant," unquote. While I truly do consider it plausible that Uske's account may have been derived from an accurate source, I also see it as entirely possible that 16th century Jews, writing during the Reconquista and the Inquisition, might have easily filled in the gaps of the historical record in order to render it more colorful and dramatic. It should also be noted here that in 653, King Requeswint said the following in the Visigothic Code before enacting some of the harshest anti-Jewish legislation to date. Quote, "Hitherto we have directed our steps cautiously through the arduous paths which traverse the iniquities of the Jews, and have used moderation in the restraint of human crimes and infirmities." Unquote. It seems odd that Requeswint would have uttered this if the conversions under Sisebut had been of a particularly violent nature. Indeed, while Isidore of Seville criticized the forced conversions under Sisebut, he also records the king as having been exceedingly merciful toward the Byzantines after he waged war to expel their outposts from Spain. He writes that Sisebut, quote, "was so merciful in the wake of victory that he ransomed many of the enemy who had been reduced to slavery and distributed as booty by his army, using his own treasure for their redemption," unquote. The Chronicle of Fredegar also claims that Sisebut was appalled by the massacre of Byzantine soldiers by his own troops and cried out, "Alas, that there should be such bloodshed in my time." Clearly, Sisebut had a sense of human compassion and decency. Nevertheless, the wording at the Fourth Council of Toledo does indicate forced conversions, even if it's not specific about their nature. The Church at the Fourth Council also clearly distinguishes between previous anti-Jewish policies under Recared and those under Sisebut. The Jews were forbidden from owning Christian slaves before under Recared, Liuwa, Witteric, and Gundamar. The key difference, however, between Sisebut and these other kings may be that Sisebut was the only one who tried to enforce the law. Indeed, Thompson highlights that, quote, "Recared's regulations about the Jews had not been strictly enforced by Witteric and Gundamar, and this Sisebut deplored," unquote. Among his sources, he cites a section of the Visigothic Code originally authored by Sisebut. Quote, "The authority of the law promulgated by our lord and predecessor Recared, declaring that Christian slaves shall under no circumstances remain in the power of Jews, would be sufficient if the depravity of the Jews had not afterwards corrupted the minds of princes, and they had not demanded and obtained benefits for themselves, contrary to the principles of justice," unquote. Essentially, Sisebut was angered by the fact that the Jews were lobbying the Gothic kings so that they might circumvent the law. Moreover, if Sisebut did violently force conversions, it should be taken into account that the Jews had violently forced Christian men to be circumcised, and we might infer from the historical record that this had been occurring for hundreds of years. Perhaps more to the point, Sisebut had done nothing to the Jews in 616 that the Jews themselves had not done to others in the past. After the Maccabean revolt in Judea, when nationalist Jews had expelled the Seleucid Greeks, they forcibly converted many locals, such as the Idumeans and the Eturians. They murdered apostates who had abandoned Orthodox Judaism in favor of Hellenistic Judaism, which they considered to be a heresy, just as the Catholics in Spain began to consider Judaism. In 167 BC, when asked by a Greek representative to offer sacrifice to the Greek gods, Jewish Cohen Mattathias murdered the representative alongside a fellow Jew who was willing to perform the act. First-century Jewish historian Josephus tells us that the Jews, quote, took also Dora and Marisa, cities of Idumea, and subdued all the Idumeans, and permitted them to stay in that country if they would circumcise their genitals and make use of the laws of the Jews. And they were so desirous of living in the country of their forefathers that they submitted to the use of circumcision and of the rest of the Jewish ways of living, unquote. As to why Jews forced conversions, the website My Jewish Learning highlights the potential political motive. Quote, first of all, historically, there's been a significant connection between proselytizing and politics. New groups come to power and coerce the local people to join their religion. Among many other advantages, converting conquered lands to your religion makes them easier to govern. This accounts for much of the spread of Christianity and Islam. Historically, Jews have not had this kind of power, though there is one known case in which Jews did in fact force Gentiles to convert. A group called the Idumeans was forcibly converted by second-generation Maccabees. However, in his book, Galilee, History, Politics, People, Richard A. Horsley wrote that the Idumeans' conversion was not especially effective, and it doesn't appear that the policy of forced conversions was popular with other Jewish zealots of the time, unquote.